Excellent. Thank you so much. Well, good afternoon again, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this cold, rainy afternoon for this informational session. We are now processing your tier for the permanent permit. So it's really great that we all can get together in this meeting, do the overview of the permitting process, and answer any questions that you might have. Before we begin, I would like to express gratitude to our city partners. I see Matthew Chandler from the Planning Department joining us here. Unfortunately, Captain Sai from the Fire Department is unable to join us because he's out sick. We send him our well wishes. Thank you so much to my colleagues, our Deputy Director, Ray Law, who is on this meeting, and my colleague, his name says Scott Dennis, but it's actually Michael Neimer. So with that, I will pass the microphone to Michael to start us off.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Yulia. I'm just going to pull up our PowerPoint here. All right, can everyone see that okay? Okay. Yeah, and Ray, do you have anything you'd like to add at the beginning or just dive into permitting? All right. Okay, so this information session is for the category of businesses known as temps, which obviously you're all a member of. I think it would be helpful before diving into the permitting process to give a little bit of historical context about this class of application. So temps are businesses that operated unpermitted prior to legalization in 2018. And following the passage of Proposition 64, temps were given a pathway to legalize through amnesty, and this process started in late 2017. So there's sort of two stages to become a fully licensed and legal business. The first one is that you can provisionally operate on a temporary permit to be renewed by the Office of Cannabis every 120 or 60 days. This was issued right away so that your businesses could start operating. And so long as the business was compliant with various conditions, it's conditional on this compliance, you could continue operating until the point at which the business was operated a permanent permit, or what is called an Article 16 permit, because it's administered by Article 16 of the San Francisco Police Code. So that second stage is when you receive a permanent permit business. These applications for Article 16 are processed in tiers, also dictated by Article 16 of the Police Code. In short, the code dictates that equity applications are processed before temporary permit applications. And that is why, while many of your businesses submitted a permit in 2018, that permanent permit application has not been picked up for processing by our office until now, or will be in the near future. So this is all.
I don't think it has a plug-in for it.
Yeah. So this is all to say that you have sort of two categories of permits. Your provisional, which you've been working with our office and the San Francisco Fire Department to renew over the last couple of years on this 120-day basis. And then you have this separate Article 16 permit, which our office is now picking up this category of permit and starting to process. So for that permitting process, I'm going to give a brief overview of the process. So it starts with initial intake and part one, which is handled by the Office of Cannabis. This is checking if you have the prerequisites to establish a cannabis business in San Francisco. Then once you make it out of part one, you'll be referred to the planning department. You'll work with the planning department to make sure your address is zoned properly, and then you get passed along to the Department of Building Inspection. When you are issued a job card by the Department of Building Inspection, that'll be the trigger to come back to the OOC for the second part of the Office of Cannabis process. We'll review the rest of your application, and then finally issue your permit. Okay, so to start off, part one in a big picture sense is are you eligible to have a cannabis business at your location, and do you have the basic requirements to establish a business in San Francisco? So the first really like category of stuff is proof to occupy. So that's normally a deed, lease, sublease, or letter of intent from the landlord. You'll also need a special letter called an explicit activity authorization from your landlord stating that you can engage in cannabis business activity at the address. We will also check that you have your ownership matches your corporate governance documents, your formation documents, and that your business is registered in the appropriate places. So we'll ask for either articles of organization or statement of information from the state of California, and also that your business is registered in San Francisco with the Treasury and Tax Collector's Office. So we'll check for things like BAN and LIN. We'll make sure your license types match with your state license. And then we'll also, in regards to ownership, we'll also need background checks from all people on your team who qualify as a capital O owner. And that is someone who owns 20 or more % of the business, or who has a direct control in the management, direction, and control of the business. They will need a background check before the process is complete. If that is time consuming up front, there is an avenue for you to complete an attestation and get the process rolling before getting the finalized background check. That's part one in a nutshell. Okay. Then we would pass you off to the planning department and then DBI. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But for now, the trigger to get back to the Office of Cannabis for the second phase of the process is an issued job card from the Department of Building Inspection. In the second part of the Office of Cannabis process, it sort of moves from do you have the prerequisites to have a business in San Francisco to really specifics about how you will run your cannabis business. These are forms that ask for your operational plans. Before sort of in this transition phase from part one to part two, one of the things you'll be asked to do is to complete a community outreach with all neighbors within 300 feet. This is an opportunity for you to get to know the neighborhood, other businesses on the street, and present your business plan in the most transparent way possible to your prospective neighbors. The planning department also has a community outreach requirement. And so the reason this you can try to get through the community outreach process before the remaining part two forms is that we, if possible, only want you to do one meeting instead of two. With that being said, the planning department and the Office of Cannabis have their own requirements for the community outreach meeting. So if you plan on doing one meeting, it must fulfill both sets of requirements. A small example of differences between offices is that the number of feet out that or the radius of feet that you need to send notifications to is different for each office. It's 300 feet for ours, and I believe 150 for the planning, but don't quote me on that. Okay, so then beyond the community outreach and good neighbor policy, when you get that issued job card, we'll release a bunch of forms to you asking about various aspects of your business. They're listed here. So we'll ask about security, staffing and labor, make sure you're complying with all applicable laws and regulations in San Francisco. Documents for other agencies. This is to check in on where you stand with your state license. General business operations, how you will go about running your business, and again, making sure it's compliant with all of the rules and regulations of the cities. And then there will also be, so these top two forms are for all business types. And then you'll also be asked to complete forms specific to your business. So for example, if you are applying for a manufacturing permit, you'll be asked to fill out a manufacturing form. And same thing for delivery. If you're applying for authorizations, this is the point, what you do. Another thing I would like to highlight here is that in to operate Article 16 permit in California, you must have, it's a dual licensure system. And so what this means is that you need a license from the state of California, overseen by the Department of Cannabis Control, as well as a permit or permits from our office. And so there is a separate process for applying for the state. But this, one of our forms will help hopefully make sure that you have started that process, and if there's any overlap between the two, try to cut down on repeat work. All right. So for the planning process is Matthew. If you're here, I think I'm going to turn the ball over to you.
Matthew, you're muted.
Hello, everybody. Assuming everybody can hear me now. If not, please interrupt me. But I am going to, if okay with you, Michael, share my screen so I can provide a presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. Here, I will exit out of ours, and yeah, screen sharing is yours. Let me know if you need permission to access it.
Nope, should be good to go. Okay, so hello, everybody. My name is Matthew Chandler. I'm a senior planner with the planning department. I also serve the cannabis permitting liaison role, working very closely with the Office of Cannabis. I provided my direct contact information there, and the planning department also has a dedicated cannabis inbox for cannabis specific questions that you can reach out to if you have any questions. Again, this is online, but I'll also provide it at the end of this presentation. So generally just an overview of planning's role and purview is that planning interprets and implements the planning code, which regulates zoning and land use. It also establishes each of the uses as either principally permitted, meaning that you can go on ahead and establish those uses. Conditionally permitted, meaning that the uses are generally okay, but they do need to be conditionally approved, and those are known as entitlements, which can have conditions attached to them. The planning code also notes what uses are not permitted and has regulations around accessory uses. Things that planning is looking at as well includes hours of operation, the size of the uses, and there's physical characteristics that are controlled by the planning code and design standards. These mainly come into play if you're looking to do any exterior changes or in the rare case of, constructing something new for your land use. Planning also reviews projects for conformance with historic preservation standards. And we issue CEQA determinations, which is the California Environmental Quality Act. It's the legal process for reviewing potential or projects against potential adverse environmental impacts. So as Michael noted, you obviously start your permitting with the Office of Cannabis, and planning comes in during this review. Planning will receive both an initial referral and a formal referral, which I'll get into in a little bit, but essentially those are going to be processes and times which you will either receive initial feedback or next steps in order to establish your land use or get your business permitted. So during this process, you'll also want to establish your land use, which may require or include an entitlement, which is typically a conditional use authorization. And then you also need to fill out a building permit application. And I think it's important to note that a land use such as, manufacturing, cannabis retail, etc., those don't actually legally exist at a property until you get a building permit application filed, reviewed, approved, and then at the end, you will receive a certificate of final completion. And then that's whenever the land use is established at a site, which of course planning is very concerned with the uses of the lands and the zoning districts. and what they allow. So during the permitting process, an initial referral will be sent to planning, which includes an extremely high-level overview of the uses and corresponding license type for the property. And planning will determine if the land use, planning will determine which land uses correlate to the requested license, and will try to determine a path for you to formally establish the requested land uses and identify, in the event that a land use cannot be established, or there's something that would preclude you from operating that is controlled by the planning code, planning will try to let you know that information upfront as soon as possible. We'll also attempt to identify and flag other major regulations or processes that may be required. So common requirements or processes could be historic preservation if you're doing exterior changes to a known or potentially known historic resource, neighborhood notification, or other relevant planning code controls. Planning will communicate this information to the applicant during this initial referral, and then once we receive a formal referral from the Office of Cannabis, we will actually provide an email to the applicant with detailed instructions for outlining next steps and what is needed in order to establish your land uses and operate your business eventually. So planning's formal review typically occurs with a building permit application unless an entitlement such as a conditional use authorization, so those are uses that in the planning code are noted as only being approvable with conditional use. So if a conditional use authorization is required, then planning's review will take place during the entitlement phase, which again, once planning receives a referral, we will let you know if your business requires an entitlement or if it could just be approved with a building permit application. So if the review occurred with the entitlement, such as a conditional use, then planning will still need to review and approve the building permit application that is used to establish or vest the land use. And for consistency, if any other changes are required, interior, exterior, planning will need to review that as well. And again, just noting that the building permit application is the vehicle or the process for formally establishing a land use, which again could be things such as cultivation, retail, etc. So things that planning looks for during our review: what are the uses? Do they require conditional use? Are there any accessory uses? Are those accessory uses allowed? Does the project meet the planning code via a plan check that the assigned planner will conduct? Is it a project under CEQA? So again, the California Environmental Quality Act. And if it is, does the project meet the CEQA requirements and can it be approved, or does further environmental review need to take place before a CEQA determination can be provided to the applicant? Planning will also take a look at any potential adverse impacts to historic resources. And if there are any changes to historic resources, do they meet our preservation guidelines, which have been adopted by the Historic Preservation Commission? So getting into each one of these in a little bit more detail, a zoning district may require conditional use authorization for establishing a land use. Again, each zoning district has a zoning control table that will outline if a use is principally permitted, conditionally permitted, not permitted, and then it also has controls for accessory uses, which I'll get into in a second as well. A conditional use may also be required in addition to just establishing land uses. Sometimes conditional use is required to establish longer operating hours. or for a use size above a certain limit. And also, which hopefully this won't be the case for anyone, but if a housing unit or a dwelling unit is removed, that would require conditional use authorization as well. Again, I don't think it's very typical for these types of projects. But do know that if your project requires a conditional use, it may take 6 to 12 months, and that is because it needs to do a complete plan check, and it will require a 20-day notification of the public hearing, and then eventually a public hearing will be scheduled, and the project will be acted on by the City Planning Commission at the public hearing, which takes place in person at City Hall. So whenever planning's looking at accessory uses, well, just briefly, an overview of an accessory use is generally an activity that is subordinate and is part of another use that is established on the site. So this could be like cannabis retail conducting consumption activities. A consumption lounge would be an accessory use to the cannabis retail establishment, or if you have a non-storefront use, an accessory use that is quite common would be an office space that's required to operate that non-storefront retail use. Accessory uses are limited per the planning code to 1/3 the square foot area of the primary use. So in the last example that I outlined, the office space can be up to 1/3 the square foot area of the primary use if you want an accessory office use. And then if your business proposes something or an activity that goes beyond what is allowed as an accessory use, then it would be considered a second primary use. So then also during the review, the assigned planner will review the project for conformance with the planning code standards, and they will issue comments to whomever is listed as the project applicant. This will, so some typical things that the planning code is going to regulate for like a retail use would be storefront transparency requirements. Bicycle parking can sometimes be a requirement. And then there's also location and operating standards, which easily is put as the 600-foot rule. If you're looking to establish a non-retail location, typical things that the planning code is going to regulate is more along the lines of the building standards and how the building actually operates. So things such as industrial buildings can't be modified to where they can no longer operate as industrial buildings. So they would need to maintain closed spaces and things of that sort. Another important topic is the CEQA review. So the California Environmental Quality Act requires the city to analyze and disclose any potential environmental impacts of any decision that the city makes. So during this process, planning will review any potential impacts to historic resources, emissions, possible emissions of odor or noise from a site, and the future land use, and possible impacts that could take place if any excavation is proposed. And planning will also take into account any possible changes to vehicle miles traveled in an area. So again, the CEQA review is a pretty complex and technical process, but from your side as a permittee, there's really not much that you need to worry about. This is all part of the plan review process that will take place by the planning department. And planning will eventually issue the CEQA determination and will provide a copy of the CEQA determination to the applicant so that you can eventually provide it to the state as required for your licensing. In the city of San Francisco, we identify buildings on an A, B, or C category hierarchy. So an A resource means that the city knows that a historic resource is present at that site. A B resource means that the property has not been looked at or evaluated, but it is age eligible. So that would be anything that is 45 years or older is a potential historic resource in the city of San Francisco. And finally, category C buildings are the city has evaluated those buildings and we have determined that it is not a historic resource. So this rating system comes into play for an applicant, mainly if they're wanting to do exterior changes. So if it's an A resource, a project cannot alter any character defining features, which these will be evaluated by the planning department. A historic preservationist will take a look at any changes to the exterior, and through their knowledge and their review process, we can let you know what has been identified as a character defining feature. And a review by the Historic Preservation Commission may be required in these instances if you're going to be altering character defining features. But if a property is a category B, meaning that it is age eligible, but it has not been evaluated, generally you don't want to be modifying any character defining features, but it can still be reviewed at staff level without requiring Historic Preservation Commission approval. So whenever you're looking to submit a permit or a project, things that planning is mainly going to look for whenever it comes to exterior changes would be like the addition of security gates. If you need to modify any storefront openings or change any door or window locations, those are things that planning is going to be looking at and evaluating during this review process. And again, your assigned planner will provide you any comments or let you know if any additional information is required in order for us to complete this review. So once a formal referral is received by the planning department, we will let the applicant know which is the proper pathway or what is required in order to obtain any building permits or entitlements. We provide pretty detailed instructions, but it's important to note that there are essentially two possible pathways. One is that an entitlement, so again, a conditionally approvable use or use that requires conditional use authorization, or some land uses are principally permitted and they can just be approved without submitting an entitlement application or going through the public hearing process. For principally permitted uses, you would file and obtain a building permit. Sometimes Section 311 notice, otherwise known as neighborhood notification, may be required before planning can approve a permit. And for the rare permits, an over-the-counter approval can be granted for by planning for principally permitted uses that are fully code compliant. They do not require any entitlement or notice, and the CEQA determination can be provided at the counter in a checklist format, or the CEQA review has already been completed during a previous review process. So that's the typical process for planning's review, but I want to outline a few best practices for existing and temp operators. One good thing to do, or what we request, is that you clarify as part of your application materials if you have any previously issued job cards, if you have any past approved permits or past approved entitlements, which again, this may not exactly be the case for most of you. One good resource is the San Francisco property information map, and I included a screenshot on the right-hand side, this is the program that we use as the planning department quite often to pool or research any property-specific data. So this will include your historic preservation status. It will also list any active or closed planning specific applications. And it will also list any active or past building permits. And you can see what I have highlighted there on the picture on the right-hand side on the left column. There are specific tabs for you to review all this information for your specific address. Whenever you do submit a building permit or any application, it should include a thorough project description. It would be best to include, if known, any existing land uses. So again, existing land uses are one which have been legally approved or established through an approved building permit. So you want to list the existing and proposed land use, if known, or provide the approximate square foot area of the use which you're requesting to establish. You want to also detail and cite the location of the work. So if you're doing changes to the exterior, you would want to note, modify exterior to increase a window opening or create a new door. Or for the location of the work, it could be things such as establish a cannabis retail use on the ground floor of the building. You also want to, it would be best if you could note the operating hours in the project description. And then also, if you have any active or past approved building permits, which again will be listed under the building permits tab on PEM, then you reference those building permit application numbers. And you can see written in orange on the right-hand side, I'm actually on the property information map. I am under the building permits tab, and you'll see permit, and then you'll see a number with multiple digits outlined in orange. Those are actual building permit applications. And the property information map will include a status for each of the permits. So it could be filed, issued, approved, expired, or completed. So that's an important, or that's a very helpful resource for you to look at whenever you're putting together your application materials that need to be reviewed by planning. So I listed the property information map, which it's a hyperlink, but easily you could just Google San Francisco planning property information map or San Francisco property information map, and it will be one of the first links that show up. The planning department has also put together a cannabis retail map, which is very helpful for retail establishments, but it also outlines other requirements and will provide some zoning information as well. If you have any cannabis specific questions for planning, please send them to this email, which is cpc.cannabis@sfgov.org. That inbox is staffed by myself and another planner whom is very knowledgeable on the planning requirements for cannabis permits. And the department has also put together a guide for cannabis related land uses. And my goal was to provide further information on where you can find this guide. However, as of today, the planning department's website is having some technical difficulties, so I'm not able to walk you through how to get to that guide. But again, if you search San Francisco Planning Guide to Cannabis related land uses, then you should find that very helpful document, which again will reiterate all planning code requirements and provide a lot of helpful resources. That concludes my presentation. I can go on ahead and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Very, very helpful information. And Michael, if you could share your screen. Move to the next item.
Yeah, which is so. Yeah, as Yulia mentioned at the beginning, that Captain Sai is unfortunately sick today and unable to attend. But that if you are working with the fire department to resolve compliance issues or resolve a notice of violation, to please reach out to the fire department, either Captain Dennis Sai or Lieutenant Victor Wong. Really is the best point to resolve that. And then I think, Yulia, that would take us to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Michael. And before we move on to Q&A, just a couple of housekeeping items. So please keep yourself muted. You will have two options to ask a question. You can either type it in the chat or you can use raise a hand function. And I think we can just alternate between raising hands and the questions in the chat. Michael, if you could please help me with the chat, and I can unmute participants if somebody raises a hand. And if you could please, once you raise a hand, if you could please stay muted until I call on you, we would really appreciate it. If you have a question, again, type it in the chat, please, or use raise hand function. Give folks a few minutes.
While we are waiting, this is Ray Law from the Office of Cannabis. Matthew, are you around? Yeah, so while we are waiting for the questions to trickle in, I do have a question that I believe will be shared by a number of our existing operators. Let's say if my Part 1 application with the
Ray, I think we just lost you. We lost you like last 10 seconds.
Oh, okay. So I was, sorry about that. And I was asking a question about, let's say if I was an existing operator, my Part 1 application has been referred to the planning department. I received the detailed information. After that, what is my immediate next step? Should I engage with your team, or should I go to the DBI and apply for a building permit? Because I heard you said that will serve as a vehicle for planning to approve my land use entitlement. Can you please clarify that point for me? Thanks.
Yeah, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to further elaborate on this. So it's really going to depend on what is the requirement for an applicant. Can they establish the use just with a building permit application, or do they require an entitlement, which planning will outline those, which step or which process is required for establishing the use there whenever we send an email to the applicant. If or I guess I'll start with the entitlement process. If an entitlement is required, there is an application. There's actually two applications that need to be submitted. One is just a general project application that is required for all permits or projects that require planning's approval, and that's just general applicant information and what you're looking to do with the property. And then the other application for entitlements is a specific conditional use authorization supplemental application. And you'll need to submit those to the planning department. And at that time, you could file a building permit application if you choose to, but you will have to have the entitlement approved by the planning commission before you can actually move forward with your building permit application. So that's the process if an entitlement is required. if just a building permit is required in order to establish a land use, then you can start the process by, I suggest looking at the Department of Building Inspection's website for their current building permit application processes at the current time whenever you're looking to file, just because they have changed a little bit over time as things have evolved with COVID and reopening and relocating to 49 South Van Ness. But I do think there's a process that you can file the building permit application online or in person. But that would be the typical process for either of those paths. And of course, you can always feel free to reach out to me or the cannabis specific inbox if you have questions about any direction that's provided from the planning department.
Thank you
Hopefully.
for sharing the detailed information, Matthew.
Yeah.
Julia, do we have other questions submitted through the chat, or anyone raise their hand?
I do not see any hands raised. However, I do see the note from Tony in the chat. I will read it. So from guest Tony, the community outreach requires cannabis business to disclose their existence and business plan to neighbors. Considering the high level of successful and attempted break-ins, this creates additional risk and exposure for cannabis businesses that typically operate with a large deal of cash. By letting neighbors in close proximity know exactly what we're doing, will the OOC provide additional security and or monitoring once neighbors are notified and 24/7 moving forward? Thank you for your note. So broadly speaking, with regard to community outreach requirements, there are specific requirements what need to be included in the good neighbor policy and also in your notice to the neighbors that need to go out 7 business days prior to a meeting. The meeting requirement is applicable not only to temporary businesses, but to all applicants for Article 16 permanent permit. If you want to discuss this more, I'm happy to connect one-on-one after the
And
meeting.
thanks, Julia. And to add to that, the primary goal of the community outreach process is to serve as a platform for business operators to establish relationships with their neighbors. Generally speaking, that all the kind of more sensitive information around the security plan, premises diagram are not required as a part of their outreach. However, you will need to designate a community liaison from your staff to serve as a communication point between you and your neighbors moving forward. So that's kind of another piece of this community outreach process. And I will pass it back to Julia for the next question.
Thank you so much, Ray. All right, I see another question. Are cannabis permits moved through planning and DBI faster these days? What have you seen are the biggest delays, and how has the city alleviated the issues with delays? Matthew, would you maybe say a few words with regard to the planning department process?
Yeah, for sure, most definitely. So I took over this role as the liaison between the planning department and the Office of Cannabis in October of last year. So the planning department has, dedicated staff in order to make sure that submitted permits or permits that have at least made it to planning are moved through the process, and that they essentially continue to progress in order to get the permit issued. So the department's definitely putting behind some resources or putting people in place in order to make sure that permits are reviewed in a streamlined manner. As part of my role, I'm also reaching out to assigned planners and checking in with their supervisors as needed to make sure that they're assigned in a particular within a specific time frame, so they don't linger around essentially or remain at the back of the line. I guess whenever it comes to delays, I think it always depends on a case by case basis. Number one is Whenever the planning department does request information or issue some sort of comments, having somebody on the receiving end that is very responsive always makes the timeline move faster. So essentially responding to planning's requirements in a timely manner. And then another thing that really can't be alleviated is the if an entitlement is required. It's unfortunate, but that process does take multiple months. But it's important for you to, or I guess it would be helpful for you to know upfront when an entitlement is required so that you can accommodate for that in your scheduling. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthew. And we definitely appreciate you and your support for our temp permit holders. All right, so we have another question in the chat here. Let me just double check that there are no hands raised. As I said, we're going to alternate. Okay, I don't see any raised hands, so I'm going to read the next question in the chat. Do NSRs need to be recorded to a property prior to submitting for a building permit?
I believe it's a planning question because this is related to the notice of special restrictions. Matthew, you want to take a step?
Sure, thank you. So yeah, notice of special restrictions is typically only going to be required for one of these businesses if an entitlement is required in order to establish or vest the land use. So if you require a entitlement such as a conditional use, then after the conditional use is authorized and you approved by the Planning Commission, the Planning Department will draft and provide the applicant a notice of special restrictions, which will essentially formalize any specific restrictions that are or conditions of approval that are tied to that authorization. So you'll receive the NSR or notice of special restrictions with instructions for recording that document to the property. And as part of the instructions, you'll also see that it requests that you produce a copy of the recorded NSR on the submitted building permit application. So I guess it technically needs to be recorded, but you can have a building before the permit can be approved. You can have a building permit filed before recording the NSR. However, you'll still have to update the submitted plans to include the recorded version of the NSR before planning can approve the permit if an NSR is required.
Thank you so much for that information, Matthew. I do not see any hands raised. Let me check the chat. Don't see any additional questions in the chat. Michael, do you see anything on your end?
I do not.
Right. Well, if there are no more questions as of right now, I put some email resources in the chat, so you're always welcome to email us directly to the Office of Cannabis. The email is octemppermits@sfgov.org if you would like to discuss your specific project. Also, as Matthew mentioned, the email to connect with the planning department is cpc.cannabis@sfgov.org. And if you have any fire-specific questions, please email Captain Sai or Lieutenant Wong. And Michael, could you please put their emails in the chat as well? I would also like to emphasize here that in order to receive extensions of your temporary permits, the Office of Cannabis is mandated by Section 1615 of the Article 16 of the San Francisco Police Code to receive approvals from other departments, which includes fire. So please work closely with the fire department to resolve any items that you might have outstanding with them. And I will check one more time if we have any questions.
And while Julia and Michael doing that, I just want to once again thank you everyone for your time as our office is moving steadily to process everyone's permanent permit application, we want to make sure everyone is supported throughout the process. And I want to thank my colleagues, Julia, Michael, and Princess from our office to make sure we have this section, and we hope the information we share today is helpful for you. And we are grateful for city partners who lean in for this process, Matthew in particular, for the information that you share. Our office always appreciate the partnership with our city partners as well as everyone from the industry. With that, I think that concludes our meeting. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you for posting the emails, Michael. Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.